as far as the future of the franchise is concerned, so Star Trek obviously has a problem in terms, I think, of its demographics. Let's face it, the fan base of Star Trek is aging out. It's getting older. In fact, I think there's actually a lot of similarities between comics and Star Trek in that in both situations, you've got a fan base that is aging, and there aren't enough new fans coming in to really replace them. And part of this is because, again, there are similar problems. With comics, once upon a time, comics were plentiful. They were everywhere. They were at the grocery store, they were at the gas station, they were at the 7-Eleven, they were at the drugstore, on the spinner racks, and you really almost couldn't avoid them. But then eventually they moved away from that general distribution and then into the comic shops. And also another problem was the price kept going up because once upon a time comics were very cheap. When I started reading comics, they were like a quarter. And nowadays your average comic is like what, $4 or $5. It's ridiculous. And I think between the price increases but that's one problem, but another is just that it's harder to find comics and harder to access them because the comics business, they kind of ghettoized themselves in a way when they moved into these strictly into these specialty shops, because now if you don't go into a comic shop expressly to find comics, you're almost never going to be exposed to them. And as a result, you're going to have it's very difficult, if not almost impossible, for young people to really pick up the hobby and get involved in it. And even if they can, are they going to be able to afford it? Again, it's like $5 a comic. It's ridiculous. And Star Trek, in some ways, has a similar issue. When I was a kid and started watching Star Trek, of course, it was in syndication. This was in the 70s. This is around probably about 75. And, it was easy to find. And that continued for many years. And even then, in the 90s, you had the explosion in syndicated shows, syndicated channels. Brian says most comic shops filled with Funko Pops and retro toys. Yeah. And actually, those Funko Pops aren't selling too well either. I don't know if you've seen the stories about how whatever the producer of Funko Pops, they're going to dump like 30 million, 35 million worth of product because they can't get rid of it because no one wants these things. I had meant to do a video on that, but I hadn't gotten around to it. But now they're moving Star Trek. Paramount is wanting to pull all the Star Trek content onto Paramount Plus and put it behind this paywall because obviously, they want to make as much money on it as they can, so they don't want anyone else showing people Star Trek. And again, that makes it more difficult to find. People aren't going to be able to just stumble across it and be like, hey, what's this? Brian says it's a bubble just like the Beanie Babies. You mean the Funko Pops, right? Yeah, yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that, the Beanie Babies. But yeah, you could say Beanie Babies, Cabbage Patch Kids. That's probably another example. Hey, Masters of Maniac Mexico, thank you for stopping by again. And he says, I'm very sorry to say that it's probably past. No presence in the present, no future. Well, yeah, I'm going to talk about that because I think in the long run you're right. But so where was I? Okay, so the barrier to entry and all that. So again, you have the situation where they're pulling all the Star Trek content behind this paywall on Paramount Plus. So again, that's going to make it hard for new fans to come into it because they can't just be flipping channels and come across Star Trek and be like, "What's this?" I mean, I guess they could on YouTube, but other than that, I don't know really where else they could do that. So again, it makes it more difficult for more new fans to come into the hobby. And again, I think because of that, you're having fewer and fewer coming in, and they're not replacing the older fans who are aging out. And another issue, I think, is the content. Again, with comics, I think part of the issue is that they began focusing so heavily on making mature content, basically comics that were darker, more violent, these longer, sort of more serialized storylines, which again make it kind of harder for new readers to jump in. And then science fiction, and particularly Star Trek, has particularly with this new iteration of Star Trek Under Secret Hideout, has been doing that too. Darker storylines, more violent, and all that. And it's just not as fun. It's just not as fun and entertaining. And again, more serialized and like the old episodic shows, where again, it's kind of hard to just step into a single episode and understand what's going on. Um, Let me see. And of course, then there's the whole issue of there's just more competition out there in terms of more sci-fi franchises and just more entertainment options in general. That doesn't help either. And now let's talk about the whole issue of episodic versus serialized. And obviously, it used to be Star Trek was very episodic. You'd have the alien of the week or whatever, and then particularly post uh, Babylon 5, you saw sci-fi storytelling, and eventually that went into other genres as well, more serialized storytelling, and that certainly has strengths to it and does have, there are positives to it, but it there's a trade-off. And I do think that Star Trek, because of the way it's set up, the whole idea of exploration and all that, it's kind of suited more to an episodic uh, sort of feel. I think a really good option would be to do what they did in this fourth season of Enterprise, where they had those sort of 3 episode story arcs. I thought that worked really well. I really liked that format. And if they would do a Star Trek series like that, where it's, a new ship exploring and all that, but then they do like these maybe 2, 3 episode story arcs or something like that, I think that could work really well. But the issue becomes, what okay, you're gonna do a new Star Trek series, where do you put it? Do you go back into, say, the Enterprise era, original series era, Next Generation era, or something in between, something more in the Discovery era, which I would hope they not do. And I mean, honestly, I think the best thing is just to move it forward. I think there's been a little too much. Lord Thoth says, "Never go back." Yeah, never. Yeah, I think there's been too much looking backward, and I do think they need to jump forward somewhat. Kind of what they did with Next Generation is kind of jump forward far enough that they can kind of disconnect themselves directly to what came before, so that if you're watching a new series, you're not going to be wondering where's the Enterprise F, let's say, where's the Enterprise F, and is Picard, or is Riker going to show up, is Geordi going to appear, where are they, what are they doing, and basically kind of start fresh. And I guess that would be maybe move forward and do the adventures of the Enterprise G, I guess, or something like that. Now, moving forward, however, also presents certain issues because in Enterprise, that we saw, what was it, the Enterprise J, is what it was, and they said in that the Enterprise J was a time ship. By the time of Enterprise J, the Federation is not just exploring space, but they're also effectively kind of like time cops. They're policing the timeline, the temporal Cold War and all that crap, which I was never a big fan of. So at a certain point, when you get to a point where time travel becomes routine, it can work when time travel's a rarity or it's dangerous or something like that. But when you can just routinely time travel, it really kind of destroys all the stakes because, in theory, just about anything can be undone. Okay, well, we failed to stop the guy and save the planet. Okay, well, let's just go back in time and try again and stop him. And so I think by the time you get to, say, the Enterprise J, you it really is going to become very difficult and not impossible to tell stories. So you've got to set it before that time, but then after, say, Enterprise F. So you're talking about Enterprise GH, I, maybe something in there. And I don't think you can really go much forward from there again because of the whole time issue. So I think that's probably the most obvious and best option again would be to do the Adventures of Enterprise G or H. The problem is I don't think you can go much forward after that. So that gets into the issue of what you're looking at long term. And I'll come back to that in a minute.